Welcome to the Voice of Truth. This is Pastor Doug Joseph, and my special guest today is Reverend John F. Harrison. And Brother Harrison, it is so good to have you with us, and you have made the long drive to come down and be with us all the way from Massachusetts. And that's one of those hard-to-pronounce state names that gets butchered so often.
Thank you for saying it right.
I had one high school teacher that really stressed to us how to say that state name properly, and I've never forgotten it. He was a very interesting teacher. He also told us the origin of the American phrase "okay," which is the presidential campaign of Martin Van Buren. His nickname was Old Kinderhook.
How about that?
Okay for short. There's several theories for how okay came about, but and of all the competing theories, it's the one thought to be the most likely and the one that makes sense historically wise. But little tidbits from high school, can you believe it? I still remember them.
I'd never heard that, but I'm glad I did, because it's one of those words I've always wondered about, because in every language, if you hear people conversing on the phone in Korean or Chinese or Russian, at some point in the conversation they will say okay.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered why.
Yeah. The other night, my wife and I watched a video of some movie. I can't even remember now what it was, but there was a character in there, and this person was an Oriental character for whom you couldn't even say that English was a second language. He did not know any English. He really only knew two words of English, and it was yes and okay. And so every time something would happen, he would say, okay, yes. So I did want to start off by giving a plug for your awesome novel, Fighting Back. And you have such a refreshing writing style. It's kind of fluey and yet gritty at the same time. And tell the folks, what genre or what category would you put your novel, Fighting Back, in?
That's an interesting question, because the answer almost depends on what day you ask me. I used to be one of those people that hated going to a bookstore and you'd pull a novel off the shelf and it would say, let's call it Autumn Leaves. Autumn Leaves, a novel. And that always annoyed me, because I thought to myself, well, I'm in the fiction section. It's a 100,000-word book. I know it's a novel. But now I understand better why they do that, because as soon as you slap a genre on it, it's suspense or it's mystery or it's whatever, then there are really hard and fast expectations that people have. I read a blog post by a famous novelist who writes suspense stories, and that's what I first thought Fighting Back was a suspense novel. And he explained that in that genre, you need to have a plot turn basically every 4 pages. And I'm thinking, well, I don't really do that. There's some nice twists in there, but not that frequent.
Yeah.
And so now what I tell people when they ask me, what kind of book is it? I say, well, it's got some action, it's got some suspense, it's got a little bit of romance, it's got theology, it's got ecclesiology. If I could sum it up in a nutshell, I would say if C.S. Lewis had written the Jack Reacher novels, that would be this book.
That is a great way to put it. You know, one of the funniest stories about my mother and my wonderful late mother, I was reminded of it when you talked about someone saying that the suspense novel should have a major development every 4 pages. For me, reading that type of thing is a little bit like being unwillingly strapped into a 150-mile-an-hour street police chase. You know, it's almost like I too fast to even absorb it. My mother loved roller coasters. And what finally took her on to the Lord was a third bout of lymphoma. And the first bout of lymphoma, a knot rose up and went away on its own. The doctor said that it's very slow, it's not aggressive, we're not going to treat it, and then it went away on its own. The second bout was more aggressive, and they treated it and felt like they did their best to get it under control. And then not long after that, she was found to have it roaring back again for a third bout. And by this time, due to her age and her diminished health, the doctor said, I don't really think you're up for trying to fight at this time. And she said, I'm not up for trying to fight at this time. But in between that second bout of chemo and radiation and second bout of lymphoma and that third bout, the family took her to a Disney World experience. And she was still frail, and she was wheeled around the park in a wheelchair, but she wanted to ride the roller coasters. And so here was my elderly, aged mother astounding the crowds at Disney World because they would wheel her up in the wheelchair. Then she would stand up feebly, and they would help her over into the roller coaster, and she would ride the roller coaster.
Wow.
And so she told the story, and I can't remember the name of it, but there's a roller coaster at Disney World that it's based on some rock and roll band, and it's the fastest, most neck-breaking thing. That novel that you mentioned that just does something every 4 pages, this is the roller coaster equivalent of it. Oh, and I mean, it just pins you back in the seat and then jerks you, just practically breaks your neck. And after that one was over, and the intriguing thing was at the end of every roller coaster ride, one of her grandsons would shout, "Grandma made it!" And the whole crowd would cheer. And so when she got off this one, he screamed, "Grandma made it!" And they all cheered. But she said, I leaned over and through gritted teeth, I whispered to one of my family members, "I did make it, but I'll not be doing that again." Tell us a little bit about what the novel Fighting Back is about.
It's 2 story arcs in one. There's what I call the physical plot, the physical narrative, which finds our protagonists through seemingly random chance running up against a very dangerous set of people that he happens to have a bit of an altercation with. And there is quite a bit of fallout from that altercation. And the physical plot is basically how he deals with all the challenges that come into his life as a result of that. There's also a spiritual arc in the story, and it's his character development. He is actually a character in a Bible parable. And I wanted to illustrate a parable. It's one that everyone has heard of, but I think most people maybe don't understand as well as they think they do. And so I wanted to provide some fictional backstory for the character. The parable is the parable of the prodigal son. And I wanted to provide some backstory. When I read the parable in the Bible, and it begins with the prodigal, the youngest son, leaving, my first thought was, well, why did he do that? And so I wanted to build in some backstory that would supply an answer for why he left. That's the physical plot covers some of that, and then take it from there. So his fall and recovery are the spiritual arc in the story, and so it's really carrying both of those lines at once.
I know that there's some pretty impacting commentary in there about human trafficking. Are there really businesses that are dealing with trafficked people in terms of like average city USA and suburbs, or is that just a fictional construct?
Unfortunately, that's real life, and in almost every city and decent-sized suburb in the country, this goes on. In researching it, I was amazed to discover that there's a section of New York City, Flushing, New York, that serves as the primary entry point for trafficked people, primarily from Asian countries, China and Thailand primarily. And from there, they are literally fanned out across America and Canada. And back in the days when sites like Craigslist had personal ads, services that they don't advertise anymore, in every city you could see dozens of these kind of businesses that, to the person walking down the street, look like a normal, everyday business, but in many cases is a front for human trafficking and illicit services. And if the book can call attention to the existence of those things in the towns of the readers, then I think it will have done an enormous service, no matter how much they like the story.
Wow. I mentioned earlier that your writing style has a wonderful fluidity to it, and yet also a grittiness. And Fighting Back, you kind of push the envelope a bit in terms of realism compared to what is generally found in Christian books. And I know I feel like I can always tell when a writer has written either from their own experience or has written from great research. And I kind of got the feeling that Fighting Back was a good mixture of both. I understand you have some background with some martial arts training.
I do, and I did draw on that in some of the fight scenes in the book. I went to my longtime martial arts instructor. He's one of the people who helped create MMA before mixed martial arts was a term, and is trained with world-famous people and is quite well known in that community. And I went to him and choreographed the fight scenes and actually fought through them.
Wow.
To make sure they worked, because nothing annoys me more than reading something in an area where I have some knowledge and it's clear that the author did not. They'll say something about, let's say, a firearm that just couldn't be true of the firearm they're talking about. The thumb safety on a Glock. Well, it doesn't have one. And so I wanted to make sure that if any experienced fighters, for instance, were reading the book, they wouldn't roll their eyes and go, okay, that wouldn't happen. So we actually choreographed the fight scenes and made sure they worked in real life.
Now, some of those aspects, like the fighting scenes and things with self-defense, that's kind of a little bit what we mean of kind of like pushing the envelope on what's generally seen in a Christian novel. And did you have any concern about possibly offending some of your readers? And where did you come down on where you drew the line on that kind of thing?
It was scary. And I did worry about maybe offending people, because I know that in most Christian novels, I put them in the realm of fantasy in my mind, because in most of them, no one does or says or thinks anything that the reader or the reader's pastor wouldn't approve of.
Yeah.
I remember reading one Christian novel years ago that featured a drug cartel. And the soldiers, the enforcers in this drug cartel, were ordered to eliminate some witnesses. And because there were minors among the witnesses, they said, in essence, wow, we can't do that. And I thought to myself, I'm not sure that's how these cartel enforcers would talk if they sound like Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
And so I wanted it to be believable.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go as far in that direction as I could without crossing the line into being crass or vulgar or anything like that. But I definitely wanted to be more real than many of the Christian books I've seen. I did worry a little bit about how it would be perceived, both some of the, I won't say violent scenes, but there are some fight scenes, and there is some violence in the book. And also some of the places that our prodigal goes while he's far from home. I worried that people would. So one of the things that I did was I sent a copy of the finished manuscript to a preacher friend who is about 2 decades older than me and very conservative, and I sweated. And I thought to myself, okay, maybe this is going to cost me And he wrote back and said that he loved it. He said there were things that made him a little angry at first. He said, but in the end, he thought it was a great book. And he's been sort of boosting the book ever since.
Wow.
In ways that really surprised me. So that it really helped to know that context, I guess, is everything. If someone writes something that is gratuitously this or that, that's offensive. But if people understand that you're taking a realistic look at what happens to people, and the first sentence of the book actually prepares the reader for what's coming. The very first sentence is, on the spur of the moment, Eddie Carruthers decided to help a damsel in distress, and thus began his long slide into darkness. So there are no surprises in terms of where he's going.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a bit grittier than most books in this genre.
Yeah.
But I think that as long as the reader is an adult, it's not a problem.
You mentioned the word gratuitous, and I think that is a horrific problem with most Hollywood movies, and the concept is that they start off from what sounds like a reasonable standpoint, which is what you mentioned a minute ago, that they don't want to make a thug sound like a Boy Scout, so they think that to be realistic. The thing is, though, as a reader of a novel or as a viewer of a video that I've purchased, I don't believe that realism has to be an unedited realism. And I don't assume that the thug speaks like a Boy Scout, and I don't assume that the thug doesn't speak profanities every other word. So, but I would want the edited version, not the tweaked so that it's unrealistic. Don't give me a Boy Scout version of the thug. Just give me the edited version of the thug.
Exactly.
And this is really I've found some tools and some tricks for being able to basically edit on my own. For some of our viewers that would benefit from this, there is a free plugin for Google Chrome that if you're watching something on Netflix, for instance, which, by the way, we dumped Netflix after, they had multiple horrific things in a row. The 13 Reasons series, which I've never watched any of, but so glorifies suicide that they actually had young viewers committing suicide after having watched the series. And then there was the whole fiasco with Cuties, where they take these girls and basically sexualize these girls in this series. And so there's been a mass exodus from Netflix. But this plugin works with that service, and it may work with other services in which you can set it, and as you watch through the browser, it basically filters out bad language for you as you go. One other thing I wanted to mention was that your portrayal of the local church was treated a little differently than Christian novels normally do. And was that a deliberate choice, or what was your thinking behind that?
Yes, there's two things I wanted to do with the local church. I know that in many Christian novels, the church is sort of there in the background, but it does not feature prominently in the plot. It's sort of understood that the Christian protagonist goes to a church. It's usually a very generic name because they don't want to pick a particular denomination or anything like that.
Yeah.
I wanted to be very specific and be realistic in the sense that for many Christians, church is a central part of their lives.
Exactly.
And so they go there regularly, and they would consult with spiritual leadership on important decisions, and they would, pray and read the Bible and factor that into their decision makings. I wanted all that to sort of be front and center. I also wanted to show the church the good, the bad, and the ugly of the local church that this character belonged to. Too often we get the sort of Norman Rockwell postcard portrayal of a local church. It's just this wonderful little building full of eternally happy people who never have any conflict with each other. And I've yet to meet the Christian whose life experience matches that portrait.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to actually show that there can be problems in a church, and they can be big problems, and what do you do when that happens, and how do you work through it?
Yeah.
That sort of thing. It was all part of the general, going back to your early question, the grittiness of it. I didn't want to sugarcoat anything, whether it was what the prodigal was doing or what was going on in the church. And as I think about it, it was particularly important to me to do that with the character as he left the church and began to have his long slide into darkness, because the biblical parable, the prodigal son, is an illustration of the grace of the father in receiving his son when he returns. And I thought to myself, if the worst thing this guy ever does in the book is miss a few synagogue services, then the grace isn't all that amazing.
Yeah.
And so I also wanted, because the parable in the Bible features two brothers, the prodigal and an elder brother, I wanted to give people the opportunity to check themselves for any of the elder brother spirit. How mad at the lead character are you going to get? Are you?
That is a great point.
So I try to mix all of those reasoning in.
You know, there was one occasion when a church member that was over the top, out of control, abusively abrasive, really without any proper basis, just really letting me have it right during a church service. It was actually, you know, in a room just adjacent to the sanctuary. It was overheard, and I had to step out of that and then come to the pulpit and preach. And so one of the people that overheard it said, "Boy, I have a whole new level of appreciation for you after that." Just at our most recent church service, we had, and you know, various families in our church have been through horrific problems and spiritual battles and emotional battles, and our church as a whole is kind of coming out of a whole perfect storm conglomerate of challenges and problems. But just in our most recent church service, I said in the microphone to the church, I said, just because we are exuberant in giving praise to God does not mean that we don't have difficulties. And it is in fact that praise that you get that God gets even in the midst of the difficulties that really has value. And I made reference to that scripture verse that talks about the sacrifice of praise. It's when the fruit of our lips gives praise to his name, when emotionally speaking, we wouldn't feel particularly motivated to praise. Yes. And David mentioned at one point that he would not offer to the Lord that which didn't cost him anything. And I think sometimes the praise that we give that comes in the midst of, I'm not praising because I feel like it. I'm not praising because everything is wonderful. I'm not praising because I haven't been in a challenge or because our church hasn't been through a struggle. That's the praise that I think is the most authentic and the most needful. You mentioned that you sent it to the one conservative preacher that had a couple of decades on you and the reaction you got from him. What other reactions have you gotten from the novel Fighting Back?
A really wide range of them, all of them supportive. I imagine there must be someone who didn't like it, but they didn't respond to me. But two of them really stick out in my mind, two responses. One was from a reader at an employer's book club, and this was not someone affiliated with the church, and it was someone who told me prior to reading it that he didn't like reading Christian books. And so I thought, oh boy. And after reading, he told me he loved it. He said, what struck me as so funny, it's a book that is laden with Christian content. There's an entire church service described in detail. It takes an entire chapter. There are Bible studies. There are discussions about Bible between various characters. There is the prayer life of the protagonist. All of that is in there. What's not in there is the thing that you normally see in Christian books, where there's an unbelieving character who gets evangelized as a proxy for the unbelieving reader. And the unbelieving reader knows this is coming and feels preached to and resents it. Well, Fighting Back doesn't do that. And so this person at the book club said, I really liked it. And, it's not really a Christian book. It's the Christian characters and they do Christian things, but it's not one of those. And I just smiled because I'm like, wow, that's not really a Christian book. So I liked his reaction. And the other one was from a different preacher who, and again, because one of the preachers portrayed in the book, I don't want to call him a bad guy, but he is one of the antagonists to our lead character. And because his portrayal is warts and all, I worried a little bit of how ministers would respond to the book. And this particular minister wrote me a short email that I printed and framed. And what he said was, I have seen the abuse. I may have been an abuser, and this book will make me a better man. I almost fell off my chair.
Wow.
And for him to have said that, been that vulnerable, I've seen the abuse, I may have been an abuser, this book will make me a better man.
Wow.
I couldn't ask for it. You can't print that on the back cover, but
Yeah.
you can't ask for a better endorsement.
You know, one of the things, there's so many things that are so powerful about writing and then reading someone else's writing. And I don't know that I can quote it verbatim, and so this is probably the best I can get at a paraphrase. But someone said once, basically, that the writer is able to actually project their mind into the reader's mind for the time that they're reading that book. One of the most powerful things about a book is it allows us to, for a brief moment, step out of our shoes and step into someone else's shoes and learn lessons that we didn't have to learn in real life. We learned it through reading. And that ability to, I think probably one of the most powerful things God has ever done for me in prayer was there was one occasion when the Lord took me out of myself and then showed me myself from other people's point of view. And it was devastating, but very powerful. But it sounds to me like that the Lord helped through your book to do that for that one minister. It allowed himself to see himself from someone else's shoes for at least a period of time, or at least in some aspect of his life.
And one of the things that really, just to second what you're saying, is that I used to not be a big fan of fiction. My first book was a nonfiction book. I used to only read nonfiction as a younger person. And my wife actually converted me to being a fiction reader. And the saying she always said was, fiction tells the truth. And I never really understood what she meant by that until I wrote this particular book. And I realized you can say things in a fictional setting and people will listen to it that they would not listen to in a nonfiction book, because in nonfiction, you realize you are reading the words and thoughts of the author and you are tempted to argue with him. Whereas in a fiction book, you're simply reading what a character thinks. You're not going to argue with a fictional character.
Yeah.
And so you'll let the fictional character speak his mind or do what he wants to do or whatever, and you'll just observe it. And it lets you be open to that process you just described, seeing yourself from someone else's point of view in a way that even nonfiction generally can't. And so it's been an exciting journey for me to realize this is a potentially powerful thing.
And I know some of our listeners may remember that that I've written both fiction and nonfiction. And in that regard, that's one of the things that you and I share in common. You've written both fiction and nonfiction. Some of your nonfiction has been about financial management, and we want to pivot to that in a bit. But with regard to your fiction writing, I don't know if maybe commiserate is the right word, but anyone who's ever tried to write knows that writing is hard.
Yes.
And so, but what's going on with regard to, is there a sequel? And if there is a sequel, what's your timetable on it?
There is, and I don't know if I should properly call it a sequel, in that the story in Fighting Back starts and ends in Fighting Back. It's a complete tale. But there is a second book in that world coming. I guess we'd call it a series. And it's in the same general location. It features the people in the same church. Different lead character in the second book, which will be called Kindred Spirits. It's someone who was a bit player in Fighting Back is now the lead character, antagonist in Kindred Spirits. So there's some overlap. There's some overlap in terms of the timeline. Kindred Spirits happens during the action of Fighting Back, just in a more compressed window. And while our lead character in Fighting Back is off doing what he's doing, then these events are going on back at the church.
Wow.
So there's actually even one chapter that overlaps.
That is so
both
cool.
Books. And so I'm looking forward to it. Timeline, if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said it would come out this past July. But that was perhaps optimistic. I'm about 60% through the writing, and then it will go out to beta readers and be revised, and then we'll go to the editor, and then finally book cover designers and formatters and all of that. So now I'm hoping for spring. And I think it will be worth the wait. I think in many respects, it's a better book than Fighting Back in that I've had more practice at this.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited for it. It's called Kindred Spirits.
Just being honest, I felt like that the three novels that I wrote, I felt like they got better with each one. But I felt like your first one was better than my third one. And so if you feel that you're improving on your second one, it will be tremendous. If you would pivot to the nonfiction, and I can hardly believe it's been like 7 years since we had you here, and your book on finance was already out at that time, so it's been a while since it's been out. So but we undoubtedly will have radio listeners hearing us right now who they don't know about your book on finances, and so talk about that a bit, and just give not only info, but go ahead and give a sales pitch about it if you would.
Sure. The book is called Making Mammon Serve You, and the subtitle is A Biblical Manual for Money Mastery. And it is hard to believe it's in 2007 when that came out.
Wow.
And I like to think it's a timeless book in the sense that most of it is not stuff that expires, specific tax codes and things like that expire. I tried to minimize how much of that was in there. Mostly it is a series of chapters, each dealing with a particular biblical principle of personal finance. It starts with the assumption that the reader knows nothing whatsoever about money and goes basics of budgeting and how to find out what your net worth is and how to do an income statement so you see what your cash flow is. And then it works its way little by little through different topics of insurance and investing and long-term, even a little bit about estate planning, and it really takes you from I know nothing about money to a fairly advanced look at asset allocation and things like that. It's humorous. It's not. I tried not to be real dry because other than watching paint dry, there's not a lot exciting, less exciting than a book about financial management. But this one. It was actually this nonfiction book that convinced me to do the novel, because in Making Mammon Serve You, there are two fictional chapters. One is the first chapter, which creates three hypothetical churches and highlights and contrasts how they deal with money in those churches. And the other one is a chapter that features a debate between two preachers on a contentious financial subject in the church world. And it is those two chapters that really grab people. People like the information in all the other chapters, but I'll tell you, I had one man tell me that he was reading the debate chapter. He got so upset he threw the book. and people really relate to those chapters. So it's by no means a dry and academic book, even though it does cover a lot of hard information. And I think it will help people really feel like they've got a degree of control and understanding that's usually missing in most people's personal financial lives.
There is a reason why Jesus conveyed so much of the moral teaching that he did in terms of narratives.
Yes.
And our English word parable comes from this ancient word parabole, and it means to cast alongside. And the concept is that Jesus is saying, I need to teach you something about the heavenly, so I'll tell you a story about the earthly. I'll get you involved in, I'll get you engaged in a story about everyday people and everyday situations that can really happen in real life. And while I'm doing that, I'll use it to cast that alongside these heavenly values, and I'll basically piggyback this moral teaching of heavenly values onto this earthly story.
It's really powerful. Even people who aren't Bible readers and don't go to church, they know the parables of Jesus. They know some of them. Yeah. And it's an amazing thing that with story you can convey such powerful truths. It's
if I had, we talked about the fact that as we write, we get better. And one of the mistakes I made in my first novel was I wanted to lay the foundation for where the story picks up. So I had this very dry, just matter of fact, it wasn't a narrative. It was just this matter of fact spewing of my concept of what history will take place between now and when the story begins, and really turned people off. They're just reading one statement after another that had no story, had no narrative, had nothing to engage you in it. Folks didn't even make it to the beginning of the story because they couldn't slog through that. And I've often thought that if I ever rewrite it, I'll start the story and then I'll spoon feed bits of that history embedded in the narrative.
Yes.
And I think that would be much more palatable for people to take.
It's a great way to do things. My editor calls what you just described info dumps.
Yeah.
And she beat me up, hit me over the head with a good number of mine.
Yeah.
And so you can't just have all this exposition. So I had to make massive changes, and it kind of hurt my feelings a little bit at first.
Yeah.
But then you're like, well, no, that's what I'm paying her for.
Yeah.
And it made it a much better story.
Now, regarding finances, one of the things that has been really mind-blowing for me that you opened my eyes to was how that there are certain things in the world of money that are counterintuitive. The reality is the exact opposite of what you would have thought the reality is. And people are really bad at counterintuitive. The thing that we absolutely think that has to be the way it is. And this is one of the surprises that researchers get when researchers delve into challenge, de-challenge, re-challenge. And you get these double-blind, randomized studies, and the raw fact that is churned out at the end is oftentimes mind-boggling to them because it's exactly the opposite of what they thought it was going to be going into it. And there are some aspects of the world of finances that are counterintuitive. And I have one that I wanted to mention, but I'm sure you have a laundry list of them. But as many Christian finance counselors advise, debt is bad. Avoiding debt is wise, with the only possible exception being that a mortgage on a home, you have the potential for its appreciation in value to outpace the interest rate that you're paying, or at least compete with it fairly decently. And Dave Ramsey and others advise that, a home mortgage is perhaps maybe the only debt obligation that makes sense. But obviously the goal would be to avoid all unsecured debt, avoid all auto loan debt. For heaven's sake, avoid debt on something that loses value over time. But when it, and currently my wife and I, that's where we are. We've been totally debt-free for several years now, except for our home loan. And I remember, and sometimes it's kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We got totally debt-free except for our home loan. And instead of saving up for our next car loan, and instead of driving the thing until it fell apart, and blew up, as Dave Ramsey says, we just basically I got lured into this sales gimmick of the no interest loan. And I learned later with chagrin that all they do is they take all the interest of the loan and front load it onto the purchase price of the vehicle. You pay all the interest. You pay all the interest in getting a bad deal the day you negotiate. So we got this vehicle. It was a Grand Caravan, got it on a no interest loan. And so we were back into having some debt. And so we paid that down as quick as we could. We got it paid off. And I thought right off the bat, the thing we need to do now is to save up for another car. And looking at some numbers, which I just did recently, I'm realizing we probably should have started socking that extra money each month as applying to the principal on our home loan instead of saving it for a car loan, or at least some of it. We've been disciplined with regard to our mortgage in that from the very start of our mortgage, we always paid $50 extra every month against the principal. And then when interest rates dipped to historical lows and it made sense to refinance, we refinanced. So the refinance, the $50 each month had shaved time off the end of the loan. The refinance then shaved some time off the end of the loan. And then continuing with the $50 each month was continuing to shave time off the end of the loan. And so then we feel like at this point we've successfully saved up enough money that if one of our vehicles does finally blow up, we'll be able to pay cash for another vehicle and not have to be back into a car loan. But I started asking myself the question of, should we take this car loan money that we've saved up and just sock it against the principal of the loan and then start afresh on trying to save up for a car loan? And I'd worked on it and, into the night. And, some people that's a really bad mistake, and other people that's when their brain comes alive the most. And I met a man down in Texas who told me his best moment was when he opened his eyes in the morning. That's not my best moment.
We have that in common.
I'm that guy who leans toward nocturnal, and my brightest moments of creativity come, in the wee hours. But so I was crunching the numbers, looking at the impact. We've got about 14. We've got our emergency fund locked in a CD, earning a great interest rate. And the interest rates are in the toilet now, so we were glad we locked it in when we did. And then we've got this just in a regular online savings account. We've got this money set aside from side jobs and book royalties, and from this where we've been paying a car payment to ourselves. So we've got about 14 or 15,000 in there, and so I was running the numbers on what it would look like if I socked that. If I just socked a chunk of 14,000 against the principal, how much does that shorten our end of the loan, and how much money and interest does it save us? And then I thought, what if we hold on to that money? Because I remember one of the things you taught me was about when the money is in your hand, you have lots of options. But the minute you pick one of those options and actually spend the money, you're choosing that option at the expense of all the others. And I thought, what if we hold on to that money to hold on to our options? And what if this couple of $100 a month that we've been paying ourselves, basically making a car payment to ourselves for this last while, what if we started socking that $200 a month plus the $50 that we've been doing, so we would increase our extra principal payment each month from $50 to $250? And I was very surprised. It saved just doing that, just keeping the saved money in hand and just increasing the monthly extra from $50 to $250. It saved almost as much interest money as the big lump sum would, and it actually was more effective on shortening the final payoff of the loan. And that to me was counterintuitive. I didn't expect that. And so my precious wife, often when I have these brilliant moments, she's in bed sleeping, which what I probably should be doing. But I wanted to wake her up, but I didn't. I sent her an email that she would get in the morning, and we had already talked about it some in the days leading up to it, and so I knew that she would be comfortable with it. And I'm not one of these kind of chauvinists that just thinks, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I don't care what my wife says. And by the way, the responsibility that men bear in a marriage has nothing to do with ignoring your wife's wisdom. And any man who feels that way is stupid and needs to go back to the book. But I knew she would be in favor of it. So that night, I canceled where we were paying ourselves a loan payment into our savings account. I canceled that, and I upped the extra payments to the bank. And then our only question was, do we do some lump sum also in addition to that? And so I ran the numbers on that, and I came to a conclusion when I showed her the analysis that I came up with. It was surprising to me. Either one of these two options were very powerful, but after having exercised either one of them, it made the other option not nearly so powerful as it was on its own. And that was very counterintuitive to me. A massive lump sum by itself, very powerful. The extra payments against principal, very powerful. But combining them is not double the powerful. One of them, and it's because of the way the interest payments taper off at the end of the loan, as the interest savings are dwindling down to nothing, it diminishes the effectiveness. And we both looked at it, and just for comparison's sake, if we made a big lump sum payment of $14,000 and then just kept paying the $50 extra, it accomplished this great result. And then if we were to agree to suffer, instead of $50 extra for the rest of the loan, doubling it to $100 extra, it would work out to 10 years of that doubled extra amount. And it would only save us $1,500 in interest. It would only shave a very meager amount of months off the end of the loan. And we thought that that's not worth it. And so in going back and forth, we finally decided it was to our advantage to hold on to the savings that we have in case one of our cars does blow up, and just change where this $200 a month has been going. And I've got this piece of paper here in front of me that basically shows that with no lump sum extra payment and just increasing our extra toward principal up from $50 to $250, it will shave 12 years off the loan and save us $21,500 of interest.
That's not a bad thing.
And so we have made that move. Yes. Hallelujah.
It's interesting you bring the particulars up, because one of the things I say whenever talking to people about financial things, and we start dealing with real-world numbers and real-world life situations, is the answer to every financial question is, it depends.
It depends.
And there's so many variables, and if we change any one or two of those variables, then your results are going to be very, very different.
Yeah.
And so people like to ask me questions like, should I do this or should I do that? It depends.
It depends.
Let's run the numbers.
Because the numbers surprise you sometimes.
Yeah, and people don't like that. They want to just tell me there's got to be a rule that this way is always the right way.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, no, in fact, beware of people who always tell you it's always this way or always that way.
Yeah.
The truth is it depends. Life is more complicated than we'd like it to be.
You know, what started me into this was I had logged into our bank, and there's our checking account, and there's our mortgage account. I clicked into the mortgage account, and our bank, as a good bank should, offered some options. Here's a little tool to see how extra principal applied each month would affect your loan. Here's a little tool to see how a lump sum would affect your loan. And not realizing that the truth of combining these two together is counterintuitive, you can foolishly, naturally assume that if I slide the slider on the extra each month, if I slide that slider over and it tells me it's going to knock 5 years and 6 months off and it's going to save, 10 or 12,000 in interest or whatever, and I take that put that in my little thinker, and then I go over to this other tool and I see what a lump sum would do, there's this foolish assumption, which isn't reality, that I can just simply add those two numbers of years saved together and add those two amounts of interest saved together. And that's not true. It's not true at all. And so I found that to get at the real numbers, what I had to do was go back to the start of the refinance. I had to bring a loan amortization up in Excel, run the numbers from the origin of the refinance, and I had to actually tweak the amortization chart because it had one field, a named field for extra payments each month. I had to add a second alternate extra payments each month. And then at a set point down in the amortization chart, I had to manually change from there on in that field which one of those two named fields it referenced. And then I had to on the very first one of those, I had to manually key in any lump sum I was getting at. And that was the only way I could get realistic numbers. And as soon as I started getting realistic numbers, I was like, this is another one of those things that's counterintuitive. I'm so glad I took the time to do this. So what are some other things in finance that can be counterintuitive that people can run into?
There really are a number of things. And while you're on the subject of debt, I'll mention an issue with that as first on my list. The idea of, I agree with all the counselors who say, avoid consumer debt if you can possibly avoid it. Avoid going into debt for things that depreciate. You know, that car is worth less the day you drive it home than the day you when you sign the papers. I agree with all of that, but we meet people where they are,
Right.
and so often they come already up to their ears in consumer debt.
Yeah.
And so much of the thinking is, all right, stop everything, don't save money, put every spare dollar you can into eliminating that debt. And the counterintuitive truth is people would be better off, usually, putting some money toward accelerating their debt reduction and putting some money toward savings. And the reason for that, one is psychological and one's mathematical.
Yeah.
The psychological reason is that if you have no savings and all you've been doing is sucking money into the debt, sooner or later something happens. Your furnace goes out, the car needs a transmission, and because you have no savings, the only way you can rectify the situation is to go back deeper into debt.
More debt.
And psychologically, that's really damaging because you're like, we were doing so well, and
Yeah.
then we went the other way.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the issues. The more important one is the actual numerical, mathematical truth is that whatever debt you're paying is compound interest on a decreasing balance. And the money you save and invest is compound interest, hitting the microphone here, is compound interest on an increasing balance. And so they're not equivalent.
They're not.
And people think, I've seen things in print, for instance, that, well, if you've got credit cards at 13%, stop putting money in your 401k and pay off the cards because you're not getting 13% in your 401k. Even if you're not, the money in your 401k is that compounding on an increasing balance, and you'll never get the time back or the opportunity to put that year's money in.
Yeah.
So it's a huge mistake to not save and invest in order to put everything into eliminating the compound interest on the decreasing balance at the expense of the compound interest on an increasing balance. That's a counterintuitive thing, but once people see the numbers, their eyes get big and wow, I've cost myself a lot of money by doing this.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things. The definition of safety is one of those counterintuitive things. If I had a few hours to go into it, I talk about even the definition of money is counterintuitive. But the definition, most people's definition of safety is if I give a bank 100 pictures of Ben Franklin, I want to know that when I go back in 2 months, there's 100 pictures of Ben Franklin waiting for me to withdraw. That's safety. My principal is guaranteed. And that safety, if what you are trying to preserve is currency, but really what people are trying to preserve is money.
Yeah.
And money and currency are not the same
They're
thing.
not the same.
Money is purchasing power.
Yeah.
And currency loses purchasing power because of inflation and taxes. So your money in the bank that is paying you at this point, 0.2% interest will buy you less in 12 months than it buys you today.
Yeah.
And people feel like it's safe there because I got my same number of pictures of Ben Franklin back. But what they're really doing is going broke safely because every year their money buys them less.
Yeah.
So what safety is anything that preserves your purchasing power. And in that sense, the money that's in your 401k is safer than the money that you have in the bank.
Yes.
Because although the short-term units of currency fluctuate, the actual purchasing power tends to grow over time, and that doesn't happen with cash or cash equivalents of money in the bank. That's very counterintuitive. People approach retirement, and they tell me, just put the money someplace where it will be safe. And I always have to have the conversation, define safe. I look at my own father. He retired when he was 62, and he had a company pension. If listeners are under the age of 40, they're like, what's that?
Yeah.
But he had a company pension, he had Social Security, and it was enough money that he and my mother were living pretty well. But he lived to be 87. And in his later years, that fixed income didn't go nearly far enough.
Yeah.
And he was beginning to struggle to pay for things. And, it was safe in terms of his units of currency never fluctuated, but it wasn't safe because his purchasing power was declining, and that meant that his standard of living was declining,
Yeah.
and that's not most people's idea of safe. So
Yeah.
there's many, many counterintuitive things like that if people are willing to hear, they're not hard to understand. They're just a different way of looking at things that will help people lead happier financial lives.
And I know anybody in our church knows this, but for our listening audience and anyone watching an archival copy of this, I am absolutely convinced that John F. Harrison is a genius. And in particular, his genius shines in the area of finances. And a big part of that is being able to take the complex, abstract, weird reality of the situation and break it down in an understandable way. That's part of the reason why that Brother Harrison, who in addition to being a certified financial planner, is also an ordained minister of the gospel, but it's a reason why he is sought after and is a very common guest on the John Blassingame radio broadcast. Remind me of the name of the broadcast again.
Jim Blassingame, he calls his show the Small Business Advocate.
Yes.
It's nationally syndicated both on terrestrial radio and also internet radio.
Yeah.
And he's made me part of what he calls his brain trust, and which is a group of recurring guests. And I interviewed with him about 3 weeks ago, and we were amazed to discover that it's been about 8 years that I've been on the show.
Wow.
And really, it's a great show. And I say that not because I'm sometimes on it, but he's a real, for anyone who makes money from self-employment or from owning their own corporation or anything like that, he's just a real font of great information, and it's a funny show.
For any of our viewers that are pastors of a church, I strongly recommend that you get with John F. Harrison regarding your personal retirement and regarding your church finances. He has many astounding, powerful, clever ways of getting done what you need done that can really help you in your finances. He's been a tremendous blessing to our church and to us personally. And the thought occurs to me that when we had you help us before, like 7 years ago, we had some priorities then. And over time, some things have turned out better than expected. Other things didn't turn out at all. And so over time, our priorities have shifted. And some of how you helped us was based on what we were telling you at that time was a priority that we wanted to honor. And because some of those priorities have faded away, we probably need to rethink some of what we are doing as a result. And it strikes me that this is something, this touches on what is perhaps the greatest weakness among married couples and the greatest weakness in families in America with regard to their finances is just a raw failure of planning, just failure to actually analyze where we're going, where we're trying to get to, how do we plan on getting there, what's the nitty-gritty detail of making that happen, are we doing great, are we doing poorly, what changes, what kind of strategy do we have? And sadly, many people are just like, well, I work at so-and-so and they have a such and such 401 whatever. What else can I do besides that? And there's a lot more that can be done. Talk about a little bit about what can be done to help folks there.
I really like, and I'll start by saying I really like the point you made about failure to plan, because there's a famous Yogi Berra-ism that says if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else. And it's a lot of truth to that. And in driving here today, I did something that I hadn't done the last time I was here. I used a GPS. I let the Google Maps lady tell me turn by turn how to get here. And it's a really neat thing, because if you miss a street or overshoot something, you hear that little noise, and she recalibrates and says, okay, in that case, take a right on this street, and it gets me back on track. And that's kind of what financial planning should be. Things do change as time goes, and needs change, priorities change, circumstances change. And you need the flexibility to note what has changed and what, if anything, we now need to do differently. And just hoping that it all works out usually doesn't work out. You have to plan right along. And I got so impassioned about saying that I forgot what the first half of your question was.
Some examples of what people can do to beyond just I work at so and so and I have a 401k. What's a basic game plan that they really ought to tackle to get beyond that meager starting place?
Well, they definitely need a few things that are their own and not provided by their employer.
Yeah.
And I would start with just basic savings. People need emergency funds, depending on their situation, anywhere from 3 months to 12 months worth of their living expenses in savings in an emergency fund. People can invest outside of their 401ks or other employer plans and should.
Yeah.
You can do things in terms of playing the tax code outside of your 401k that you can't do within it. And what I mean by that is in your 401k, you're getting the tax deduction for the money that's being contributed, and it's growing tax deferred. You have a silent partner in that account. That's Uncle Sam. And on the day you start making withdrawals, he'll tell you how much of your withdrawal he wants. And you won't really have much of a choice but give it to him.
Yeah.
So on your own, you can do things that are taxed differently. You can have a standard taxable brokerage account. You pay taxes on it as you go, but you can take advantage of capital gains rates, which are lower than ordinary income tax rates. You can also do things with Roth options, where after-tax money goes in, but it grows free of tax, and provided some I's are dotted and some T's are crossed, the money comes out tax-free. So it's one of the few arrangements that lets you understand how much spending money you'll have when the time comes, because whatever comes out is spendable.
Yeah.
Whereas on the traditional retirement plans, what you are seeing come out is a gross distribution, and what will be spendable is whatever portion of that Uncle Sam allows you to keep. So doing things with different tax treatments, doing things that make different kinds of investments available. Your 401k will have anywhere from 5 to 15 or so different mutual funds in it. But there are about 9,000 mutual funds in the world to choose from today, not to mention individual stocks, individual bonds, things that aren't related to stocks and bonds at all. Being able to broadly diversify your holdings so that whatever goes on in the world, and today when you turn on the news, you wonder about what's going on in the world and how it's going to impact you. There's a Bible verse in Ecclesiastes that I think really ties into this idea, and it says, "Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be on the earth."
Yeah.
And I look at that and say, that's a good asset allocation strategy.
Yeah.
If you have 7 or 8 asset classes, cash, stocks, bonds, other things, pretty much the demise of one of them won't sink you.
Yeah.
Maybe the stock market is far down, but gold prices are up. Or maybe, and so by spreading out, if far beyond what's provided by your employer, you can make yourself both safer and much better off over the long term.
I think the old-timey wisdom is don't put all of your eggs in one basket.
Amen.
And so I do want to mention, especially for those that will be viewing this online right away, we have this precious man, Reverend John F. Harrison, here this coming Saturday for a 90-minute finance workshop with questions and answers allowed for afterward, and then one-on-one help by request later that day. And I encourage you, this is free. It's open to the public. Any of you can come. You don't have to be a member of our church. Please come, glean from the wisdom, and for heaven's sake, do buy his books. And then also after the finance workshop on Saturday, he will be preaching the Word of God for us both Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and Sunday night at 6 p.m. This precious man has journeyed long, and you're a bit of a road warrior. He's got a great strategy on buying really really well-made cars that you can get lots of long life out of, and he is willing to make road trips that would make others faint. And he has driven a long way to be with us. And I encourage you, avail yourself of this opportunity. Come and hear him speak. It will bless you, and it will strengthen and encourage you and help you. Hear him preach the word of God. Hear him teach on finances, and you will benefit from it. My longtime friend, I am so glad to have you with us in Clarksburg. Thank you so much for being here with us. We'll go ahead and wrap up our broadcast, but do you have any last words you want to give?
Just thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to helping any and all that I can, any way that I can while I'm here. And it's great to be back, both for that aspect of things and just to see you again, because it's been a while.
Yes, sir.
So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the days to come.
Yes, sir. God bless you all, and we hope to see you this Saturday and this Sunday in Jesus'